At a quiet funeral in Montana, everything is still, until a chain snaps. A massive horse breaks free and charges straight toward the coffin. People panic. Get it away. But the horse doesn't attack. He stops, lowers his head, and presses his muzzle gently against the wood, like he's saying goodbye. They pull him back. He refuses to move. And suddenly the entire crowd realizes this isn't chaos. It's grief. Like and subscribe to uncover what happens next and enjoy the story. Montana didn't do grief gently. It did it the way it did weather cold, blunt, and unavoidable. A small cemetery sat on a low rise outside town, the sky above it pressed flat and steel gray, like God had laid a lid on the afternoon. Wind skated through the headstones and dry grass, whispering over names no one said out loud anymore. Jackets snapped, flowers trembled in their ribbons. A funeral was already underway. Not loud, not theatrical, just heavy. The kind of silence where even a cough feels like disrespect. Earl Dawson's coffin rested on a simple metal stand near the open grave. Dark wood, clean lines, the corners sharp as a decision. A thin line of mourners stood in coats and boots, faces carved into polite sorrow. A pastor's voice tried to sound steady, tried to keep the world orderly, but Montana didn't care about order. And neither did the sound that came next. Metal clinked, then a hard, ugly snap like a chain reaching the end of its patience. Heads turned toward the fence line. And that's when they saw him. A massive gelding stood just outside the cemetery gate, half shadowed by a leafless cottonwood. Dark coat, thick neck, muscle stacked on muscle like he'd been built for a war nobody else remembered. His breath smoked in short bursts. His eyes wide, focused, almost unnervingly calm-locked on Earl's coffin as if it were calling him by name. Someone whispered it before they could stop themselves. Briggs. A few people stiffened instantly. The name didn't land like a horse's name. It landed like a warning. A man near the fence, one of the funeral helpers, reached for the lead rope. His hands were gloved, but his grip was already tight, like he knew what came with touching that animal. "Hey," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Easy. Easy." Too late. Briggs surged. Not a trot, not a spook, a decision. The rope went taut so fast it sang. The man stumbled, boots skidding in the gravel, shoulder jerking back like he'd been hooked to a truck. Panic moved through the mourners in a ripple one step back, then another. "Get it away from here," someone snapped, sharp with fear. Another voice, higher. "Is that Earl's horse?" The pastor stopped mid-sentence. The funeral director lifted both hands uselessly like he could pause what was coming. Briggs kept moving. He hit the gate line like it wasn't meant to stop him. Chain links rattled. A post groaned. And then, somehow, he was inside the cemetery grounds, closing the distance with the coffin in 3 long strides, hooves thudding soft on the damp earth like drumbeats nobody wanted. A woman gasped. A man reached for his wife's arm and pulled her behind him. And in that split second, a question flashed through every mind like lightning. Is he going to flip the coffin? Is he going to trample somebody? Is this how Earl's burial ends blood on the grass? But then Briggs stopped, right at the coffin. He didn't rear, he didn't strike, he didn't pin his ears and lunge at the nearest body. He lowered his head, slowly, carefully, as if the air itself was fragile, and he pressed his muzzle to the wood, gentle, deliberate, like a hand on a shoulder. The cemetery seemed to inhale all at once. The man with the rope tried to pull again, voice cracking now. Come on, boy, let's go." Briggs didn't move. Another mourner stepped forward, anger trembling over grief. "Pull him back. This is a funeral." 2 men approached as if they could surround a storm and make it behave. They grabbed the rope. They leaned their weight into it. They tugged. Briggs stayed. He stood so still it was almost worse than violence. Stillness like a vow. Someone shouted again, sharper now, more desperate. Get him away. He's dangerous. Dangerous. That word had followed Briggs around town like a shadow. Dangerous because he'd hurt men before. Dangerous because he didn't accept strangers. Dangerous because he didn't belong to anyone the town could understand. Yet here he was, at the edge of death, acting like the only one who knew how to mourn. They pulled harder. The rope creaked. Briggs's muscles tightened under his coat, but his hooves didn't shift. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the men dragging at him like he was an object. His entire world had narrowed to the coffin. To Earl. A gust of wind came through the cemetery and rattled the flowers, bending them toward the grave like they were bowing. Somewhere, a crow called once harsh and lonely. The pastor swallowed and tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come, because the scene in front of them didn't match anything they believed about animals, or about Earl Dawson. Briggs breathed out long, controlled his nostrils pressed close to the wood as if he were searching for a last familiar scent. His eyelashes fluttered once. His ears flicked toward the crowd, hearing everything, registering the fear, the anger, the confusion, and still he didn't leave. Not when they tugged, not when they shouted, not when someone muttered, low and ugly, "If he doesn't move, we'll have to make him." Briggs simply stood at Earl's coffin like he belonged there, like he had earned the right. And that was the part that truly unsettled them, because a horse doesn't come to a cemetery by accident. A horse doesn't break a chain and cross miles of cold wind just to stand by wood and earth. Not unless something inside that animal knew what the town refused to admit. This wasn't random. This was personal. And whatever promise had pulled Briggs here, it was stronger than fear. Why would the town's dangerous horse act like a grieving widow? And why now at the coffin? By the time Briggs reached the coffin, the town had already decided what the moment meant. Trouble. That was the first instinct in places like this. Not sorrow, not wonder, not the possibility that something sacred might be unfolding right in front of them. Just trouble. The wind moved low across the cemetery, carrying the smell of turned dirt and wilted lilies. Boots shifted in the grass. People who had come to say a few final words for Earl Dawson now stood frozen in a half circle, their attention pulled away from the grave and locked instead on the horse who had no business being there. Pastor Leanne Whitaker lowered the folded page in her hand. She was barely 35, new enough to the county that she still pronounced certain ranch names too carefully. He still believed every funeral could be guided toward peace if you found the right sentence and said it softly enough. But this was no longer a service she could steer. This was something older than language, wilder than protocol. At the back of the mourners, Dale Rourke watched with his jaw set hard. Dale was the county brand inspector, a man who trusted paperwork more than people and control more than mercy. He wore a tan work jacket with the collar turned up against the cold, boots polished clean despite the mud, and the expression of a man already rehearsing the report he would file after this was over. He did not like disorder. He liked ownership records, boundary lines, and things that stayed where they were supposed to stay. Briggs had never been one of those things. Neither, if he was being honest, had Earl Dawson. No one in town would have called Earl cruel, but very few would have called him easy. He had lived alone on the south end of the valley in a weather-beaten ranch house that always looked like it had one foot in winter, even in July, yet the porch sagged, the fence posts leaned, the barn stood because it had not yet found a reason to fall. He drove the same truck for 22 years, bought feed in cash, and answered questions with as few words as a man could use without being accused of silence. If you saw him in town, he nodded once. If you talked too long, he left. He did not sit at the diner counter swapping stories. He did not linger after church. He did not volunteer details. People built their own versions of him because Earl never offered one. Widower, some assumed. Maybe. Estranged from children, others said. Could be. Too stubborn for company, too proud for help, too set in his ways to need anybody. That was the version the town settled on because it made his solitude easier to explain. But solitude, like old wood, can hide rot where no one thinks to look. There had been no family at the funeral, no son with Earl's eyes, no daughter gripping a tissue in the front row, no out-of-state relatives flying in late with stories about summers on horseback and Christmas mornings by the stove. Just neighbors. A few ranch hands. Pastor Leanne, Dale, Helen McCready from the property east of Earl's, and the funeral director who had met Earl exactly once and now stood wondering if his liability insurance covered grief with hooves. That was what struck Leanne most. A man had lived nearly 80 years in this valley, and when they laid him in a coffin, there was almost no one there who could say what had broken his heart, what he feared at night, or what he had prayed for when no one was listening. All they had were fragments. The way he always bought extra oats in bad weather. The way he never sold Briggs, even when the horse became more burden than asset. The way he once drove 20 miles in a snow squall for antibiotics, then told the vet it was for livestock, as if saying more might make the care look soft. Briggs, even now, with the horse standing motionless against the coffin, the name moved through the crowd like a remembered injury. Briggs was not the kind of animal people forgot. Years ago, when Earl first brought him in, the horse had come off a broken arrangement no one ever fully explained. Some said auction. Some said seizure. Some said he'd been passed around so many times the paperwork had grown cleaner than the truth. All anyone agreed on was this. The horse was big, difficult, and wrong in a way folks could feel before they could define. He had put one ranch hand in the dirt with a shattered collarbone. He had bitten another man through a canvas jacket badly enough to leave a scar that still puckered white in winter. He didn't tolerate strangers, didn't like fast hands, didn't forgive loud men. The town called him mean because it was a simpler word than wounded. Only Earl could go near him when Briggs first came home. Only Earl could halter him without a fight. Only Earl could stand in the stall doorway and have the horse lower his head instead of pinning his ears. Only Earl could rest a hand on that broad, dark forehead and make the animal go still. Not obedient. Still. There was a difference, though most people had never cared to learn it. Shouldn't have brought him around people at all, someone muttered now, close enough for others to hear. Never should have kept that horse. Helen McCready turned her head but said nothing. She was in her 70s, wrapped in a thick brown coat with a scarf tucked tight at her throat. Her face had the worn honesty of prairie women who had spent half their lives enduring weather and the other half enduring men who thought weather was harder. She had lived next to Earl for 12 years and understood something the others did not. A man like Earl Dawson didn't keep something dangerous for the pleasure of owning danger. He kept it because he knew what it was to be given up on. Still, even Helen had not expected this. And because Briggs was not supposed to be here. That fact began to spread in uneasy murmurs as the first shock wore off. He was tied back at Dawson's place. I saw Tommy Reed secure the chain himself. That's 10 miles from here. In this wind. No trailer marks on the road either. The murmurs thickened. A funeral helper still held the broken lead, staring at it like the snapped metal might explain itself if he looked long enough. The chain end swung against his knee with a dull clink, proof that the horse had not simply wandered loose. He had broken free, and not in a blind panic. The timing was too exact. He had come straight here. Dale stepped forward at last, keeping his weight balanced, his eyes on Briggs. He tracked the truck, he said, not because he was certain, but because certainty sounded better than mystery. He saw the movement, picked up the scent. Horses do that. But even as he said it, his tone lacked conviction. The cemetery was not on the direct road from Earl's place into town. The procession had taken the long route past the church and across Miller's Ridge to avoid washed-out ground on the lower path. A horse would have had to cut through open pasture, a line of cottonwoods, and a barbed wire boundary to reach this hill. In weather like this, with the wind shifting hard from the north, no. This was not tracking in any ordinary sense. This was intention. Pastor Leanne knew the crowd felt it too, though most resisted naming it. She had seen enough grief by now to know that people feared the unexplainable not because it threatened them, but because it accused them. It forced them to admit that the world might contain bonds they had overlooked, loyalties they had mocked, tenderness they had mistaken for weakness. And Earl Dawson had been easy to misunderstand. He had lived like a locked door, not because he hated people, because somewhere along the way he had stopped believing they would knock kindly. After his wife died, yes. There had been a wife, though younger folks barely remembered her. Something in him had folded inward and stayed there. Martha Dawson had been the one who waved from the porch, the one who brought pie to church suppers, the one who laughed too loudly at small things. When cancer took her, it did not just leave Earl alone. It left him unfinished. After that, he quit showing up for anything that wasn't necessary. He sold off some cattle, let the north pasture go rough, spoke less. A man can vanish in plain sight in ranch country if he keeps paying his taxes and fixing his own fences. That was Earl, visible but unreachable. Then Briggs came, and whatever the town thought it knew about Earl began to shift in ways they didn't want to examine too closely. Because the horse should have broken him, financially, emotionally, physically. Instead, Briggs became the one living thing Earl never gave up on. There were mornings Helen saw Earl out by the paddock before sunrise, coat buttoned crooked, steam rising from his coffee cup while Briggs stood on the other side of the fence watching him. Not pacing. Not threatening. Just watching. As if the two of them were keeping an appointment neither had ever spoken aloud. There were nights when Earl's barn light stayed on past midnight. There were winters when Earl skipped buying himself diesel on time, but never ran short on feed. The town noticed, but only in the lazy, half-interested way people notice devotion when they have already decided it is foolish. Old man's gone soft, they said. That horse will kill him one day, they said. Some even said Earl kept Briggs because no one else would take him, and Earl was too proud to admit he'd made a mistake. But there was another possibility, one no one had bothered to test. Maybe Earl understood the horse better than the rest of them because he had once stood in that same dark place himself. Maybe he recognized in Briggs the same thing grief had carved into his own bones, the reflex to strike first, the refusal to trust, the rage of something hurt too deeply and too early. Now, in the cemetery, with Briggs's muzzle still resting against the coffin, that possibility became harder to dismiss, because this was not the behavior of a beast out of control. This was control under pain. This was discipline in the presence of unbearable instinct. The horse did not paw, did not scream, did not lunge at the crowd pressing in with fear and judgment. He simply stood guard over the dead man as though the right to stand there had been purchased with years nobody else had witnessed. Helen felt a chill move under her coat that had nothing to do with the wind. She remembered one winter morning 3 years earlier when she'd found Earl at the feed store loading hay cubes alone. He had looked tired in a way that reached past the body. "You need help?" she had asked. "No." "That horse worth all this trouble?" Earl had paused, one hand on the truck bed, eyes drifting somewhere past the storefront and the road and the sky beyond it. Then he had said, quiet as frost, "Some things are only trouble to people who never stayed long enough to understand them." At the time, Helen thought he meant the horse. Standing here now, she wasn't so sure. Maybe he had meant himself. A gust tore through the cemetery, sharper this time. The funeral flowers bowed low. Briggs lifted his head an inch, then settled again, as if bracing against something no one else could feel. Around him, the mourners shifted uneasily. The pastor's notes trembled in her hand. The funeral director looked toward Dale. Dale looked toward the patrol car near the road. And somewhere behind all of it, behind the cold and the grave, and the horse who had crossed 10 hard miles to reach a coffin. A new question began to form. Not just how Briggs had gotten here, but what, exactly? Earl Dawson had been protecting all these years. The town had always preferred simple explanations. A bad horse, a strange old man, a hard life producing hard things. That was easier than admitting they had watched something rare for years and mistaken it for stubbornness. In the cemetery, Briggs still stood at the coffin with a stillness so complete it made the mourners uneasy. His dark muzzle rested against the polished wood. His breath came slow, fogging the air in soft bursts. Around him, people shifted in the cold, waiting for the scene to turn into something they recognized. Violence, chaos, a problem to solve. But it refused, and in that refusal, memory began to rise, not just in one person, in all of them. Because Earl Dawson had not hidden Briggs from the world completely. He had only protected the parts of the bond the world did not deserve to handle carelessly. There had been a time, years earlier, when Briggs first arrived in the valley, that men came by Earl's place just to see the horse everyone was already talking about. Some came out of curiosity, some out of pity, some out of the particular kind of confidence that lives in men who believe any animal can be conquered if the hand is hard enough. Briggs had come in thin, wrong, and furious. That was the memory Helen Macready could never shake. She had seen him in those first weeks through the slats of Earl's barn, a dark shape coiled around Payne. His ribs showed beneath the hide. There was an old welt along his flank. A scar crossed the top of one shoulder like a sentence written in anger. His eyes had not looked wild in the foolish, dramatic way people like to say. They had looked cornered. There was a difference. The first man who tried to help had not noticed it. He had opened the stall too fast, stepped too close, and reached like he was grabbing equipment instead of touching something alive. Briggs had exploded with the speed of a nightmare. Hooves against wood. A body slamming backward, men shouting. Earl moving in, not with force but with that low, unhurried voice that somehow cut through panic better than any command. "Back off," he had said, not loud, worse than loud, certain. The ranch hand had staggered out cursing, one sleeve torn, pride injured worse than flesh. By sundown, the story had already spread through town in its ugliest form. That horse is crazy. That horse is mean. That horse ought to be put down. Earl heard all of it and kept feeding Briggs anyway, kept showing up anyway. Every morning before dawn, when frost still silvered the fence wire and the valley looked half-made, Earl crossed the yard with a bucket in one hand and patience in the other. He never marched into the paddock, never challenged, never turned the encounter into a contest of wills. He stopped several feet away, set the bucket down, waited. Sometimes Briggs stayed at the far side of the fence, ears flat, muscles bunched, watching him like a prisoner measuring a guard. Earl stayed where he was. Sometimes he talked, sometimes he said nothing at all. But when he did speak, it was never the sharp, performative language other men used around difficult animals. No threats, no domination, no cheap swagger. Just the plain voice of a man who had run out of interest in pretending strength meant cruelty. "Morning, boy." Wind through the rails. "You don't owe me trust," boots in frozen dirt, "but I'll be here when you're ready." The first week, Briggs would not come near him. The second week he came 2 steps closer and stopped. The third week, Earl sat on an overturned bucket outside the paddock and drank his coffee in silence while Briggs watched him through the fog of his own breath. The town noticed, of course. People always noticed what they could mock. At the feed store one afternoon, when Earl was loading alfalfa pellets into the bed of his truck, a man named Warren Pike had leaned against the ice chest and grinned like he was offering wisdom. "You're wasting good money on a butcher's mistake," he said. "Should have sold him for dog feed while you had the chance." A few men laughed. Earl kept loading. Warren pushed again. "What's the plan, Dawson? Talk him into being civilized?" That was when Earl looked up. Not angry, just tired in a way that carried more truth than anger ever could. "Civilized," he said, "is usually just a nicer word for broken." The men stopped laughing after that, though none of them admitted why, because Earl had a way, now and then, of making the cruelty in a joke sound exactly like what it was. What people never understood was that the work between Earl and Briggs did not look impressive from the outside. There were no cinematic victories, no dramatic first ride, no sudden transformation where the dangerous horse became gentle enough for children and church picnics. That wasn't the story. The story was smaller, harder, holier. It was a man showing up every day when the world said the effort was pointless. It was a horse learning, inch by inch, that not every outstretched hand came with pain behind it. Helen remembered the first time Briggs let Earl touch him. It had been near dusk. The kind of Montana dusk that didn't so much fall as deepen, blue shadows gathering around the barn doors while the last light held on stubbornly to the fields. She had come by to return a fence tool Earl had lent her and found him standing just outside the stall. No rope, no halter, no audience. Briggs stood inside, head high, body taut. Earl said something too quiet for her to hear. Then, he slowly enough to look almost impossible, he lifted one weathered hand and placed it against the center of Briggs' forehead. The whole barn seemed to stop breathing. Briggs did not bolt, did not strike, did not toss that great dark head and send Earl sprawling. He went still, not submissive, not defeated, still in the way a storm goes still when it recognizes the mountain is not trying to move it. Helen had felt tears sting her eyes then, though she would have laughed if anyone had accused her of sentiment, because she knew what she was seeing. Not training, recognition. As if something shattered in both of them had, for one suspended second, realized it was no longer alone. Later, people would say Earl had a gift with animals. That was another lazy explanation. A gift made it sound easy. There was nothing easy about the years that followed. Briggs remained wary with everyone else. If a stranger moved too fast, he pinned his ears. If a man came at him with dominance in his shoulders, Briggs answered with cold fury. He never stopped being a horse shaped by old harm. But with Earl, another self emerged. Not tame, trusted. That trust revealed itself in moments the town barely deserved to witness. On bitter January mornings, Earl walking the fence line while Briggs shadowed him from inside the pasture, stride for stride, as if escorting him through his own land. On spring evenings, Earl sitting on an upturned feed bin in the barn aisle, while Briggs stood with one hind leg cocked, drowsing to the sound of that low, human voice. During a thunderstorm one summer, when lightning cracked so close it shook the windows, Helen looked across the dark field and saw the barn, light burning. Earl was inside with Briggs, one hand braced against the stall door, speaking into the thunder as if neither of them intended to let fear win alone. And there had been one moment small to anyone else, the unforgettable to Helen, when Earl had said the truest thing she had ever heard him say. She had brought over canned soup after Earl caught a chest cold that kept him in bed 3 days longer than he would admit was reasonable. He was thinner then, slower getting up from the table, his hands rough and unsteady around the mug. From the kitchen window, Briggs could be seen in the paddock, standing near the far fence beneath a low white sky. Helen had looked out at him and said lightly, "Funny thing, that horse watches the house like he's waiting for you to come back out." Earl had followed her gaze. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, without looking at her, he answered in a voice so quiet it sounded borrowed from somewhere deeper than speech. "He knows what it feels like to be left." Helen had turned toward him then. Earl kept staring out the window. "And he knows," he added, "I came back." Only now, standing in the cemetery with Briggs pressed to the coffin, did the full weight of those words settle into place. Yet the horse had not loved Earl because Earl fed him. Not only that, he had loved him because Earl had done the one thing wounded creatures remember with their whole bodies. He stayed. He stayed through the danger, stayed through the mockery, stayed through the expense, stayed through every day Briggs gave him a reason to walk away, and because Earl stayed, Briggs learned a truth the world had once denied him, that not every bond ends in abandonment. Back in the cemetery, a hard gust rattled the dry grass and tugged at black coat hems. Briggs lifted his head a fraction, then lowered it again to the coffin, as if confirming what the wind kept trying to steal from him. No threat in him. No madness. Only the terrible discipline of love in public. People saw it now, whether they wanted to or not. The horse they had called dangerous was not acting like a beast cornered by instinct. He was acting like a guardian who had finally caught up with loss. Pastor Leanne watched him with wet eyes and a still face. Dale Rourke watched him with something harsher unease shading into irritation, because men who live by control do not like evidence that tenderness can command more power than force. Helen looked at Briggs and felt another memory stir, one she had nearly forgotten. A winter evening. Earl standing by his truck. Snow threatening. His gloves tucked in one pocket, his shoulders bent with the tiredness of a man who had carried too much grief too long. She had asked him then, almost teasing, "What is it with you and that horse?" Earl had given a faint smile. Not enough to count as happiness, enough to count as truth. "He's not what they think," he said. Helen had shrugged. "Maybe not, but he's sure not easy." "No," Earl had said. "Neither am I." Then he'd climbed into the truck and driven away, leaving her with the strange feeling that she had just been told something important in the plainest language possible. Now she understood. Earl had not broken the horse. He had met him in the only place real trust is born, not in obedience, not in fear, but in mutual damage recognized and handled with care. And that was why Briggs had crossed cold miles and broken iron to get here. Not because he was confused, not because he was wild, because somewhere inside that powerful scarred body lived the memory of one man's steady hand on his forehead and one promise stronger than chain or distance. "You're safe in here." The mourners stood in that truth without knowing what to do with it. Because once a town realizes it has misjudged both the dead man and the horse beside his coffin, the silence changes. It stops being ceremony and becomes shame. By then, the funeral had split into two versions of itself. One was the version Pastor Leanne had prepared for. A brief prayer, a few quiet words. The coffin lowered with dignity. Heads bowed, people returning to their trucks before the cold settled too deep into their hands. The other version was the one standing in front of them now. Raw, disordered, unignorable. A horse with his muzzle against a coffin. A dead man whose silence was somehow saying more than the living ever had. And a crowd that could no longer tell whether it was witnessing a disturbance or a truth too large for protocol. The wind rose again, sharper this time, cutting across the cemetery hill and flattening the grass around the graves. The funeral flowers shivered in their stands. One ribbon tore loose and went skidding across the dirt like a white snake. And nobody moved to catch it. Nobody wanted to move at all, because Briggs was still there, still pressed close to Earl Dawson's coffin, still refusing every command the world knew how to give. The funeral director, a careful man named Nolan Pierce who had spent 23 years avoiding scenes exactly like this one, looked at his watch out of habit, then immediately hated himself for it. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment the horse crossed the gate, but routine was all he had left. He cleared his throat. "Pastor," he said softly, though softness sounded thin against the cold, "we do need to proceed." Leanne looked at him, then at the open grave, then at Briggs. The service sheet in her hand fluttered like a trapped bird. She knew he was right. You cannot leave a coffin above ground forever because grief has changed the script. And yet nothing in her training had prepared her for the moral violence of what proceed now required. Two ranch hands exchanged a look. One of them, Tommy Reed, the same man who had secured Briggs at Earl's property before the procession stepped forward with the broken lead chain wrapped around one gloved fist. Tommy was broad-shouldered and usually calm, but there was a fresh humiliation on him now, the kind men wore poorly. Briggs had broken free under his watch, in front of half the county. He wanted the horse moved not only because the moment had become dangerous, but because something inside him needed the world to go back to obeying. "We can't stand here all day," he muttered. His partner, Wade Kessler, nodded once and came with him. They approached Briggs from an angle, slow enough to appear cautious, fast enough to reveal intent. The crowd pulled back. Instinct. They made a wider ring around the coffin, leaving Briggs at the center of it like the eye of a storm that had not decided yet whether to stay silent. Tommy lifted the chain. "Easy now. Come on." Briggs did not move. Wade reached for the hanging end of the lead rope. "We'll just turn him off the coffin, that's all." That was the lie people told themselves whenever they were about to force something sacred into a shape that felt manageable. Just turn him. Just move him. Just get this over with. Tommy took one more step and set his hand on the rope near Briggs's cheek. That was when the horse lifted his head. It happened in a single fluid motion. Not explosive. Not panicked. Deliberate. His ears pinned flat. His neck arched. His whole body went from mournful stillness to iron readiness. And then came the sound. Not a shrill whinny. Not a frightened snort. A deep, rolling warning that seemed to begin somewhere below the ribs and tear its way out through the cold air, a sound so primal and controlled at once that it made every person in the cemetery feel it in their spine before they understood it with their minds. Tommy jerked backward. Wade stumbled a half-step and swore under his breath. Briggs did not lunge. That was what made it worse. If he had attacked, people would have understood the rules again. They could have labeled it aggression, chaos, threat. They could have answered it with force and called themselves practical. But Briggs did not attack. He warned. Cleanly. Clearly. Finally. Like a man drawing a line in the dirt with the barrel of a rifle and saying, "This far." No farther. The cemetery went dead silent. No prayer. No wind. No human voice. Only the memory of that warning hanging in the air like smoke. Then someone near the back said what fear had been waiting to say. "This is insane." Another voice rose, tighter. "He's guarding it." "No," a third person shot back. "He's trapping us here." That was the thing about panic. It always tried to turn devotion into threat because threat was easier to punish. Dale Rourke stepped forward at last. He had stayed still as long as he could, letting the funeral director worry, letting the pastor hesitate, letting the ranch hands fail. But Dale was a man who built his identity around being the one who acted when everyone else grew sentimental. Order did not restore itself. Order had to be imposed. His boots crunched over the frozen ground as he entered the circle. "We can't have this," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority had been a habit in him for so long it traveled ahead of the words. "Not here," he added, eyes locked on Briggs. "Not with people this close." Pastor Leanne turned toward him. "Dale. We are past Dale," he said, clipped and cold. "That horse is unsecured, agitated, and standing over a coffin in an open cemetery. If he spooks, somebody gets hurt." The word agitated slid through the crowd and began doing its work. People latched onto it because it sounded official, responsible, cleaner than what was actually in front of them. Briggs stood with his chest angled protectively toward the coffin, nostrils flaring once, then settling. His tail did not swish. His hooves did not paw. He was more controlled than half the people staring at him. But Dale had already chosen his version of the story. He reached inside his coat. The motion hit the crowd like a spark in dry grass. Several people gasped. One woman clutched her husband's sleeve. Tommy Reed muttered, "Jesus." For one terrible instant, everyone thought the same thing. Gun. Dale pulled out his phone. A breath released around the circle, brief and shaky, but it did not last, because Dale was already dialing as he kept his eyes on Briggs. "Sheriff's unit's still at the road," he said. "Get them up here." Nolan Pierce stepped in. "Now hold on." "No," Dale snapped. We should have ended this when he broke through the fence. At the base of the hill, where 2 county vehicles had been parked for traffic and procession control, an engine turned over. The nearest patrol SUV rolled forward across the gravel approach, tires crunching slow and loud in the hush. It stopped just short of the cemetery gate. A deputy stepped out young, broad, hand hovering near his belt the way men are taught to do when they don't yet know whether calm or force will be required. Deputy Evan Mora took one look at the scene and froze. Horse, coffin, crowd, brand inspector, pastor. He had expected maybe a drunk mourner, an argument over parking. Not this. "What do you need?" he called uphill. Dale didn't look away from Briggs. "I need containment." That word landed uglier than the others. Containment. As if grief were a spill. As if the bond between Earl and Briggs were something leaking out in public and embarrassing the county. Leanne stepped forward, boots sinking into the damp earth. "No one's been hurt." "Yet," Dale said. "He's not charging." "Yet. He's warning people off the coffin. That coffin needs to move." The deputy started up the hill, slow and uncertain. He was young enough to still feel the tension between procedure and conscience as an actual physical pain. His eyes flicked from Dale to Briggs to the open grave and back again. "Sir," he said carefully, "Animal Control's 40 minutes out." "We don't have 40 minutes." Dale turned slightly toward the patrol vehicle. "In the lockbox," he said. "You've still got the tranquilizer kit from the fairground seizure last month?" The deputy hesitated. The entire cemetery seemed to stop breathing again, because now the thing that had existed only as fear became visible. Sedation. Not later, not somewhere private, not with careful planning and veterinary supervision. Here, at a funeral, in front of Earl Dawson's coffin, in front of the grave. Pastor Leanne's face changed first. Shock, and then disbelief, then something harder. "You cannot be serious." Dale looked at her with the exhausted impatience of a man who had long ago confused pragmatism with moral superiority. "If that horse goes sideways, we'll have a corpse and casualties in the same patch of ground." Briggs lifted his head slightly, sensing the shift, though he could not know the words. Animals rarely understand language. They understand intent, tension, weight in the air. And the air around him had gone metallic. Deputy Mora did not move toward the SUV. Instead, he said, "A trank round in this temperature, with this crowd, on uneven ground, sir. If he drops wrong, I know what I'm doing." That was another lie men like Dale told with complete sincerity. Helen McCready stepped forward before she realized she had decided to. "No, you don't." All eyes turned to her. Her cheeks were red from the cold. Her gloved hands shook, but not from fear. "You do not know what you're looking at," she said. Dale gave her a hard stare. "I'm looking at a dangerous animal." "No," Helen said. "You're looking at a goodbye." The words moved through the cemetery with the force of a bell toll. Some lowered their eyes. Some bristled. Some looked at Briggs as if seeing him for the first time and not liking what that first look revealed about themselves. Dale did not soften. "I am not letting sentiment get someone killed." He extended a hand toward the deputy now. "Get the kit." The deputy remained where he was. It was only a beat, maybe 2. But hesitation, in moments like this, becomes its own kind of testimony. Pastor Leanne stepped between Dale and the coffin. Not dramatically, not recklessly, just enough. Enough that if he wanted a clear line toward Briggs, he would have to acknowledge that he was aiming through a pastor at a funeral. "Not like this," she said, and the wind caught her black coat and pressed it against her legs. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "You want to explain this in a report? Fine. You want to explain it to the bishop, to the sheriff, to the entire town? Fine. But you do not sedate that horse beside the man he came here to mourn." "Mourn," Dale said, almost laughing, though there was no humor in it. "He's an animal. Leanne held his gaze. "So are we," she said. "The difference is he's acting with more dignity than the rest of us." That struck the crowd harder than shouting would have. Because it was true. People shifted again, but differently now. The fear was still there. So was the cold. So was the possibility of danger, but something else had entered the circle and would not leave. Shame. Not because they were afraid, because they were afraid of the wrong thing. Briggs, meanwhile, lowered his head once more. Back to the coffin. Back to Earl. He did it slowly, almost wearily, as if human chaos had become background noise to the only task that mattered. His muzzle touched the polished wood, his eyes half closed. He stood there under the threat of ropes, vehicles, officials, and needles, and refused to flinch. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was loyalty made visible. Dale saw it, and perhaps that was what angered him most. Not the disruption itself, but the fact that the horse's stillness was making his authority look small. A man could control gates, documents, roads, permits, but he could not command reverence once it had appeared. At the edge of the cemetery, the deputy looked down toward the patrol vehicle, then back up at Briggs, then at the open grave. His hand fell away from his belt. "Sir," he said quietly, "I don't think he's going anywhere." Dale's jaw flexed. "No," Helen whispered, eyes on Briggs. "He isn't." And with the whole cemetery held in that impossible pause, coffin waiting, grave open, law hesitating, at your mercy under threat, the balance finally tipped. Because once people see a horse choose grief over fear, they can no longer pretend they are dealing with madness. They are dealing with meaning. And meaning is much harder to remove than an animal. The cold did not ease. If anything, it deepened. It settled over the cemetery like a second silence, heavier than the first, pressing against coats, hats, collars, and skin. The kind of Montana cold that made men tuck their chins down and women rubbed their gloved hands together without realizing it. But no one left. No one even stepped back now. Because the moment had changed. Fear was still there. Of course it was. Briggs was still a 1,200-pound animal standing beside a coffin with enough strength in his shoulders to knock a grown man flat. The open grave was still waiting. Dale Rourke was still standing there with authority in his posture and frustration sharpening every line in his face, but something else had entered the air and taken hold. Attention. The crowd was no longer staring at Briggs as a problem. They were watching him as if he might explain something the dead had left unfinished. Pastor Leanne stood motionless a few feet from the coffin, black coat pulling in the wind, service pages crushed quietly in one hand. Deputy Evan Mora had stopped halfway between the patrol SUV and the grave, no longer reaching for the tranquilizer kit, no longer pretending procedure could absorb what was happening on that hill. Even Dale, for all his anger, had not moved closer. Because Briggs had made one fact impossible to ignore. This was not panic. This was purpose. Helen McCready felt it more sharply than the others because she had lived next door to Earl Dawson long enough to recognize the shape of his silences. She knew the difference between his stubbornness and his sorrow. She knew how he used quiet the way other men used locks. She also knew, with the sudden sick certainty of memory arriving late, that what was happening now had not begun here. It had begun years earlier in half-spoken sentences, strange requests, and moments the town had dismissed because they were easier to laugh at than to understand. Helen took a step forward, then another. Her boots sank softly into the damp earth between headstones. Wind lifted the edge of her scarf and snapped it back against her shoulder. She looked small compared with Briggs. Small compared with the coffin. Small compared with the force of all the eyes turning toward her. But grief has a way of making certain people larger than their bodies. "Wait," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Something in it made even Dale stop. Helen raised one shaking hand. Not like a command, not like an argument. more like someone feeling for a memory in the dark and begging the room not to break it before she found it. "Earl said something," she murmured. No one answered. A funeral crowd, even one rattled into fear, still knows how to recognize the sound of a truth trying to surface. Helen swallowed. Her gaze moved from the coffin to Briggs, then past both of them, as if she could somehow see Earl standing where he should have been instead of lying in the wood between them. "It was years ago," she said. "Winter, I think. Maybe the second bad one. The year his pipes froze twice." The details sounded almost absurd against the size of the moment, but that is how memory works. It arrives carrying weather and kitchen light and the exact position of a chair before it brings the thing that matters. "He'd been coughing real hard," Helen continued. "Wouldn't go to the doctor, naturally. I took him soup, chicken and rice, and he complained it was too salty before he'd even tasted it." A few strained smiles flickered through the crowd and vanished. Helen did not smile. He was sitting by the window. Briggs was outside the house near the fence, just standing there, watching. Not grazing, not moving. Watching. Her throat tightened. She pushed through it. "I asked Earl why that horse kept staring at the house like that, and Earl said—" She stopped, drew one breath, then gave them the sentence exactly as it had been given to her. "He said, if I die before him, don't let them take me away until Briggs says goodbye." The wind moved through the cemetery. Nothing else moved at all. The words seemed to hang there, impossible and plain at the same time. Tommy Reed frowned first, as if his face was trying to reject what his ears had accepted. "He said that?" Helen nodded. "Just like that?" Dale let out a short breath through his nose. "People say strange things when they're old and sick." Helen turned toward him, and for the first time that afternoon, and there was heat in her expression that had nothing to do with grief. "No," she said. "People say true things when they're old and tired enough to quit dressing them up." That landed. Not dramatically. Worse. Deeply. Because the town knew what kind of man Earl had been. He did not waste words. He did not traffic in sentiment. He did not make whimsical requests because loneliness had made him soft in the head. If Earl Dawson had said it, he had meant it. And if he had meant it, then the horse beside the coffin was not interrupting the funeral. He was obeying it. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it was different now. Less like panic. More like people rearranging something inside themselves and not liking the sound it made. Pastor Leanne lowered her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the sudden and terrible beauty of it. A request no one had taken seriously while Earl lived had now returned in flesh and breath, demanding to be honored by the very people who had dismissed it. Deputy Mora glanced from Helen to Briggs to the coffin and back again. He looked younger than before. Not because he had changed, but because the world in front of him had suddenly become older and stranger than the rules he trusted. Dale remained rigid, but Helen was not finished. "There's more," she said. That was the sentence that shifted the air again. Because grief can survive one revelation. It can absorb a promise. It can even make room for a horse guarding a coffin if the promise is true enough. But "there's more" means the ground is still moving. Helen's hands trembled once against the front of her coat. She pressed them flat to steady them. About a year after Earl first brought Briggs home, he got sick. Real sick. Fever, chest trouble. Bad enough I had to go in the house after he didn't answer the door. She spoke slowly now, each word drawing a line deeper into the story. "I made him tea, put wood in the stove, and straightened up some things because that place looked like a man had been trying to live without admitting he was living." A few heads bowed at that. It was too accurate to resist. "In the bedroom," Helen went on, "there was a little tin box on the dresser. I wasn't snooping." She added it sharply because even now Earl's privacy seemed like something she owed him. "I was moving medicine bottles so he wouldn't knock them over. The lid had come loose." She looked at Briggs. Inside was a folded letter and an old halter tag. Pastor Leanne's head lifted. Dale's expression changed barely, a tightening around the mouth. A small, involuntary flicker in the eyes. Helen caught it because she had spent a lifetime reading the face of men who thought control made them unreadable. "The tag didn't say Briggs," she said. Nobody spoke. The cemetery had become a held breath. Helen took one more step toward the coffin as if she owed the truth proximity. It said, "Mercy." The word moved through the crowd like a dropped stone through dark water. Mercy. For 1 second, the name seemed almost too perfect to be real, too literary, too tender, too openly meaningful for a life as hard-edged and unsentimental as Earl Dawson's. And yet, the moment it was spoken, something about Briggs changed in the crowd's eyes. Not physically. He still stood the same. Dark, broad, scarred, unmovable. But the name reached backward and altered the shape of every memory tied to him. Mercy. Not because he had always embodied it, because someone had wanted him to, because someone had seen a creature shaped by brutality and chosen not to name him after what he had done under pain, but after what he had been denied. Helen's voice lowered. "I never asked Earl about it then. You don't live next to a man like that by prying open what he's chosen to keep shut. But a few weeks later, I did ask him one thing." She closed her eyes briefly, calling the memory forward. I said, "Why Briggs? Why keep using that name if the tag says something else?" The wind hissed through the grass. Helen opened her eyes, and Earl said, "Because mercy is what he deserved. Briggs is what the world turned him into." Silence. A deep, awful, humbling silence. Pastor Leanne covered her mouth with one hand. Deputy Mora looked away, then back again, as if the act of looking had suddenly become a form of respect. Tommy Reed dropped his gaze to the broken chain at his feet. Even Wade Kessler, who had been all nerves and readiness a minute earlier, seemed to shrink inside his coat. Only Dale stayed hard, but now his hardness looked less like certainty and more like resistance. Helen saw that too. And then she saw one more thing. At the edge of Dale's composure, almost hidden, was recognition. Not of the emotion in the moment, of the name. That was what chilled her. Because most of the people standing in this cemetery were hearing "mercy" for the first time. Dale Rourke looked like he had heard it before. His face recovered quickly, flattening into official disapproval. "That proves nothing," he said. The sentence came too fast, too prepared. Helen turned fully toward him. "No," she said quietly, "but the way you answered does." The crowd shifted again. Eyes moved from Helen to Dale. Dale's jaw tightened. An old halter tag is not evidence of anything except a previous owner. "Maybe," Helen said. Then she looked at Briggs, at the dark head resting against Earl's coffin, at the disciplined stillness in that massive body, at the years of devotion no one had bothered to count. "Or maybe," she went on, "it's evidence that Earl was trying to save more than a horse." That settled over the cemetery with almost physical force, because now the story had widened. This was no longer just a mystery about why Briggs had come. It was a question about what Earl had known, what he had protected, and why a man so private would keep a letter and a false name hidden in a tin box beside his bed like they mattered more than money, more than land, more than nearly anything he left behind. Briggs exhaled softly then, his breath ghosting against the coffin lid. The sound was so small compared to everything around it, and yet every person heard it. Because once a crowd begins to understand that the dead had a secret tenderness and the feared creature beside them may be carrying part of it, even the smallest sound becomes testimony. Helen stepped back at last, drained by the memory, steadied only by the truth of having said it aloud. Pastor Leanne moved toward her and touched her elbow gently. "Why didn't he tell anyone?" she whispered. Helen kept her eyes on the coffin. "Because people around here know how to use a wound against you," she said, "and Earl had already buried enough." Then, softer, almost to herself, "Maybe he thought the horse's story wasn't safe with us." No one argued, not even Dale, because for the first time that afternoon the whole cemetery could feel it. The outline of something larger beneath the funeral, beneath the fear, beneath the years of rumor and judgment, a hidden mercy, a buried name, a promise remembered by an animal when every human being except one old woman had forgotten it. And standing there between the open grave and the horse who refused to abandon the dead, the town understood that this was not the end of the story. It was the first crack in the coffin of everything they thought they knew. After Helen spoke, no one in the cemetery seemed to know where to put their hands. That was the first visible sign that something inside the crowd had broken open. Men who had come expecting to stand through 10 respectful minutes and go home now stared at the ground as if it might offer instructions. Women who had spent years mastering the art of neat public grief suddenly looked undone in quieter, deeper ways. Even the cold felt different now. Less like weather, more like witness, because a name had entered the moment and changed its shape. Mercy. Not Briggs. Not the hard, blunt name the town had attached to the horse they feared. Mercy. And, once a living creature is seen through the name he was meant to carry, it becomes harder, sometimes impossible, to return him to the version the world found convenient. Briggs, or Mercy, stood exactly where he had stood before. Massive. Dark. Breath smoking in the steel-colored air. But now, to the people ringing Earl Dawson's grave, he no longer looked like an interruption to death. He looked like part of the burial itself. Dale Rourke still held his posture like a weapon. He had not surrendered anything aloud. Men like Dale rarely do. But the force had gone out of the scene he was trying to control. The deputy was no longer moving toward the patrol vehicle. Tommy Reed had let the broken chain sag at his side. Wade Kessler, who earlier had seemed one bad second away from bolting downhill, now stood with his hat in both hands, twisting the brim without realizing it. Pastor Leanne stepped closer to the coffin, slower this time. Not toward Briggs, toward the truth. She had officiated funerals for infants and coal miners, for schoolteachers and veterans, for women whose families overflowed the pews, and for men who died with almost no one left to claim them. She knew that grief always exposed something larger than the dead. Regret, love, resentment, relief. Sometimes all 4 in the same row of chairs. But this was the first time she had watched a town realize it had misjudged a man and his one great companion at the exact moment it was trying to bury one of them. Leanne stopped a few feet away and looked at Earl's coffin, then at the horse, then back again. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "He waited," she said. No one asked her to explain. They understood. Mercy had waited all these years for Earl to come back from feed runs, from town, from bad weather, from sickness, from grief. And now, at the one return that would never happen, he had crossed miles of cold ground to keep the final appointment himself. Helen McCready closed her eyes for a second. In her mind, memories moved through one another like lantern light through dust. Earl at the paddock fence before dawn. Earl in the barn aisle at dusk. Earl standing at the kitchen window with one shoulder bent lower than the other, not because of age but because sorrow always settles unevenly on a man. And now Earl in a coffin, surrounded at last by the witness he had trusted most. Deputy Evan Mora took off his hat. No one told him to. It was simply the only thing left that felt right. The gesture seemed to give permission to the others. Hats came off. Hands lowered. Mouths closed. Even the people who had been muttering fear a few minutes earlier now stood in a silence that felt less like restraint and more like repentance. Dale noticed it. Of course he did. Men who build themselves out of authority always notice when a room leaves them. He drew a breath through his nose, stiff and sharp, then said, "This doesn't change procedure." but the sentence sounded thin now. Like a rule recited in a church after the congregation has already encountered something holier than the sermon. Nobody answered him. Because everybody was looking at the horse. Mercy shifted then. Just once. Not the restless movement of agitation. Not the loaded coil of a coming strike. A single, slow step closer to the coffin. The metal stand gave a faint, almost inaudible creak beneath the redistributed weight of the moment. A few people tensed instinctively, but Mercy did not crowd the coffin. He only brought himself near enough that the side of his face could rest more fully against the polished wood. It was an intimate motion. So intimate that several mourners had to look away. Not from fear this time, but because it felt indecent to stare directly into someone else's private grief. His breath fogged the varnished lid. In, out, in, out. A long, aching rhythm, as if he were trying to settle his body around the fact that the scent on the wood was Earl's and also not Earl's, as if some part of him still expected warmth to answer from the other side. The wind came up over the hill and caught along the horse's mane, lifting the coarse black strands before letting them fall again. Mercy did not move. Pastor Leanne's throat tightened. Years from now, she would forget pieces of her own prayer from that day. She would forget which hymn had been chosen, who brought the flowers, which family sent the casserole to Helen's porch afterward. But she would never forget the impossible dignity of that horse-refusing spectacle. No rearing, no screaming, no chaos to give frightened people the excuse they had been waiting for. Only restraint, only fidelity, only sorrow too large for language moving through a body built for labor and survival, not ceremony, and yet somehow making ceremony sacred by standing inside it. Helen whispered, "Go on." At first, no one knew whether she was speaking to Mercy, to Earl, or to the moment itself. Then the horse let out a breath that changed everything. It was not loud. If the crowd had still been muttering, they might have missed it. But now the cemetery was so quiet that the sound seemed to pass through every rib cage on the hill. A deep exhale, rough at the end, not a snort, not a warning. Something closer to pain dragged through discipline. Mercy's eye, dark and intelligent beneath the winter light, tightened slightly at the corner. The wind had been needling across the cemetery for over an hour now, and grief-like strain had worked its way through every muscle in him. Moisture gathered where cold air, pressure, and living tissue met. Tiny at first, almost nothing, then larger. It clung to the lower rim of the eye, trembling there as though deciding whether to hold or fall. A woman near the back pressed her hand to her mouth. Tommy Reed stared openly now, broken chain forgotten. And Deputy Mora did not blink. Dale Rourke saw it too, though his face hardened as if he could reject the meaning by refusing the reaction. The drop slipped free. It slid down the dark curve of Mercy's face and fell onto the coffin lid. A small, darkened mark against polished wood, gone almost immediately into the finish, but everyone saw it. And because human beings are creatures who need language fast when the heart outruns the mind, the word formed at once in the crowd, unbidden and unanimous. Tear. No one said it loudly. No one had to. The cemetery knew. Now, whether it was caused by wind, strain, cold, or some combination of all three no scientist would ever sanctify into sentiment, did not matter. Not here, not on this hill. Not beside this grave. The body had done what the body does under unbearable pressure, and the heart of every witness had recognized something greater in it. They called it a tear because there was no other word broad enough to carry what they had just seen. But Pastor Leanne's composure finally gave way. She covered her eyes, took one unsteady breath, and let it out shaking. A rancher who had mocked Earl for years turned his head sharply and pretended to study the horizon, but the reddening around his eyes betrayed him. Wade Kessler lowered his face into one hand. Even Nolan Pierce, the funeral director who had spent a career smoothing chaos into order, stood with wet lashes and no idea what professionalism was supposed to look like anymore. Helen's chin trembled. "There," she whispered, not to the crowd, but to the coffin. "There. He did it. He came." The sentence tore something loose in the mourners. A woman began to cry openly, not with decorum, not with the tidy, controlled tears expected at a respectable burial. Real crying, the kind that bends the shoulders and steals the air. Her husband put an arm around her and, after a second, his own mouth broke too. Because what they were feeling was larger than pity for a horse. It was the shame of having mistaken loyalty for danger. The shame of having treated Earl Dawson like a man with no one when he had been deeply, unmistakably loved. The shame of knowing that the truest mourner at his funeral had arrived on 4 scarred legs. Mercy stayed there a few seconds longer, then a few more. No one rushed him now. No one tugged the rope. No one reached for the tranquilizer kit or invoked procedure. The entire machinery of human control had been humbled by one drop of moisture and the disciplined stillness that framed it. Dale looked around and understood before anyone said it. He had lost the crowd. More than that, he had lost the moral center of the moment. If he ordered action now, he would not look strong. He would look cruel. And cruelty, once exposed at a funeral, is difficult to dress back up as duty. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders lowered. Not in surrender. Men like Dale do not surrender cleanly. But in the quiet recognition that force had been outlived by something he could neither regulate nor explain. Mercy drew one last long breath against the coffin. Then, at last, he lifted his head. The movement was slow enough to feel ceremonial. He looked down at the wood for a suspended second, ears angled forward, body utterly still. It was as close to a final kiss as any of them would ever witness. Then he stepped back. One pace. Nothing dramatic. No flourish. No collapse. No miracle designed for applause. Just one deliberate backward step, freely chosen. The whole crowd felt it at once. He was done. Not with grief. Grief would remain, but with this duty, with the promise, with the goodbye. And in that instant, everyone on that hill understood something that would haunt and heal them in equal measure for years to come. Earl Dawson had not died alone. He had simply loved in a language the town had been too shallow to learn until the final hour. No one gave the order. And yet, somehow, everything resumed. The funeral director, Nolan Pierce, was the first to move, but not the way he had planned before. Not with urgency. Not with quiet efficiency meant to erase disruption. This time he stepped forward carefully, respectfully, like a man entering a space that no longer belonged to him. The men who would carry the coffin followed. Slow steps, measured breath. No one reached for Mercy. No one even looked at him with fear anymore. Because the truth had already done its work. The coffin lifted, wood rising from metal with a soft final sound that seemed to echo deeper than it should. The weight shifted into waiting hands. The grave stood open, patient as it had always been. And Mercy did nothing. He did not block them, did not warn them, did not resist. He simply stood where he had stepped back, watching with the same stillness he had brought to the coffin, as if he understood something the others were only beginning to learn. The goodbye had already happened. This part, the lowering, the dirt, the ritual, was for the living. The men carried Earl forward. One step, then another, boots pressing into soft ground, wind bending around them. And as they passed Mercy, something quiet and irreversible settled over the scene. No one flinched. No one rushed. No one tried to take control of something that no longer needed controlling. Because once a promise has been honored, there is nothing left to force. The coffin reached the edge of the grave. Ropes were set, hands adjusted. Pastor Leanne found her voice again, not the voice she had prepared, but the one that had been given to her through everything she had just witnessed. "We commit his body to the earth," she said, and this time, the words carried weight. Not because they were spoken well, because they were finally understood. The coffin descended, slow, steady, final. No one spoke while it lowered. Not even the wind seemed to interrupt. Helen bowed her head. Tommy Reed wiped his face with the back of his glove, rough and quick, as if the gesture itself embarrassed him. Deputy Mora stood at attention without knowing why. And Dale Rourke. Dale did not move, but something in him had shifted. Not enough to change the kind of man he was, but enough that, for once, he did not reach for control. He watched. That was all. And sometimes, that is the beginning of understanding. The ropes slackened. The coffin touched earth. A sound so soft it barely existed, and yet every person there felt it, because it wasn't just wood meeting ground. It was the closing of a life the town had never truly seen. A shovel moved, then another. Dirt began to fall. Not fast, not heavy, just enough to mark the moment. Mercy turned then, not sharply, not suddenly. He turned the way a creature turns when it has finished something important and no longer needs to stay exactly where it happened. He walked a few steps up the hill, stopped, and looked back. The entire cemetery seemed to follow his gaze. A horse on a rise, a fresh grave below, people standing in silence between what they had believed and what they now knew. Mercy did not call out, did not run, did not return to the coffin. He simply stood there, still, watching, as if committing the place to memory, or guarding it in a way no fence ever could. Helen lifted her eyes and saw him against the gray sky. And for the first time that day, she did not see a dangerous animal. She saw what Earl had seen, a life that had been given a second name, a second chance, a second meaning. Pastor Leanne closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, and letting the image settle. Because some moments are not meant to be rushed past. They are meant to be carried. Dale finally turned away. Not in anger, not in victory, just away. As if something had been decided without him. The mourners began to drift, slow and quiet, down the hill toward their trucks. No one spoke loudly. No one broke the silence with small talk, because there are moments that strip conversation down to nothing and leave only understanding behind. And above them all, Mercy remained, a dark figure against a pale sky, unmoving, unforgotten, a witness to the man who had once stood beside him when the world called him something else. And now, standing alone but not abandoned, he returned the favor. Some goodbyes don't need words, only a heart that refuses to forget.